everybody. It is really a great pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. After so long time, this is my first in-person event, so I'm really glad to be here in Bilbao. So I'm going to present today a report that we write in CaixaBank Research on the agri-food sector. We publish it once a year, and you will see that we try to use as much as we can the internal data of the bank and other sources of information to get a sense of how the sector is evolving and trying to inform and understand how things are moving in the agri-food sector. So the plan for the next 20 minutes is first to show some data looking at the evolution of the agri-food sector during the pandemic. And I will show you the resilience of this sector, of course, when we compare with the rest of the economy, that we have suffered a very severe economic crisis, and we are still, getting out of it. In second, I would talk about changes in the food consumption patterns of Spanish households using internal data of the bank on credit card and debit card transaction information and the use of e-commerce to buy food. And third, I would like to show you some information on automation, digitalization, and the sustainability of this sector. So to start, let me show you this chart where you can see in the red line the real GDP of the Spanish economy, and no surprise, in the second quarter of last year, we experienced a very severe drop of almost 25% decline in year-over-year terms. So it was a very severe contraction of the economic activity motivated by the great lockdown. Clearly, you can see in the green line the gross value added of the primary sector, and you can see that despite the closing of the economy, the primary sector continued to produce and even accelerated the pace of production. So we can clearly see in the data this strategic position of the primary sector as the main provider of food for the value chain and the economy. In 2020, the sector grew by 5.3%, okay? And the contribution increased from 2.7 in 2019 to 3.2 in 2020. So this is a half percentage point increase of the primary sector. It's still, even in the last data that we have for the first quarter, it still exhibits a very good performance. If we look at the second, we have the agri-food sector. When we talk about it, we usually think about the primary sector and then the industry, the transformation of the food industry. And you can see here the industrial production. And in April last year, we have this huge decline of manufacturing production because of the lockdown, of course. And you can see that the food industry, it suffered a little bit, but compared to the overall economy, it was really a much wilder decline. And we can see that the recovery since then has been sustained. And we can see that, it's not still complete. So we are, the food industry in Spain, the latest data is from April 2021. It's still 2.2% below pre-crisis levels, but we can see that it almost has recovered, the full capacity. In terms of affiliates, for instance, we have data since May, and we can see that around 2% of the affiliates of the sector are still in furlough schemes. This is less than 3%, the 3% that is for the overall economy, and of course, much less than other sectors like tourism, etc. Okay? So we can see on the food industry, when we look at these aggregate indicators from the supply side, that there's been a huge recovery of the sector, but still not yet complete. This is from the supply side. Next, I would like to look at the demand side, okay, from the consumption perspective. And here, as I start explaining at the beginning, what we are looking is at the data, internal data of the bank on transactions, credit and debit card transactions on the points of sales of CaixaBank, okay? And you can see in the blue solid line the expenditures in supermarkets. You can see in March last year, when the great lockdown started, we had this huge spike, an increase of 90% on that same week when the economy was closed. And then you can see that during the first wave, we had a normal increase of 60, almost 70% of most weeks of that period, April, May. Then you can see that after that, it has more or less stabilized around 20–30% above pre-crisis levels, okay? So the expenditure in supermarket is still, quite elevated, okay? Even now that after the end of the state of the alarm on May 9, we can see that it's still 20% above pre-crisis levels, okay? So this switch of demand of food from restaurants to supermarkets is very clear when we also look at the blue line and then compare to the red line. The red line, the red solid line, is the expenditures with the Spanish cards in restaurants. We can see this huge drop of almost 80% in the first week of the lockdown. Then you can see that it remained really, really very low during April, May last year. Then during the summer, we can see this recovery. It almost normalizes with increases even around 20% overall. Here, of course, we have to take into account that we are looking at transactions with cards, and there was a substitution between cash and card. Okay, so it's not that the turnover of the restaurants increased by 20%. You have to take into account that there was a substitution of cash towards cards. Okay, then you can see in October again the red line that goes down. Second, third wave. We have this spike in the Easter week, and then now we are around this 20% more or less in restaurants. This again is with the Spanish cards. The problem here is that we have the credit and debit cards of foreigners that is still at very, very depressed levels. And this is what you can see in the dotted red lines in the bottom of the chart. And you can see, a decline of almost 100% during the great lockdown. Then we have, a small recovery during the summer, but really not much, and still very, very depressed levels, 60–70% below pre-crisis levels. And here is where you can see the impact on the food value chain of the sector. We have a lot of products that have a market that is basically the HoReCa channel, just restaurants and this type of establishments. So we have wine, certain types of meat, cheese, or even seafood that have a lot of difficulties to find alternative markets, okay? So while restaurants are closed or have very depressed levels of turnover, we can see that, despite that overall the sector is doing quite well, we have the HoReCa channel that has been closed or with a lot of restrictions, and the production or some products have suffered because of this. Let me show you this data for the Basque Country in terms of the restaurants, the expenditure in restaurants in the three provinces, Vizcaya, Álava, and Guipúzcoa. And you can see that the pattern is more or less similar to what we've seen for the overall Spain. The Spanish cards, with these three waves of expenditure, and now more or less we could see that they are in pre-crisis levels or even somewhat above that. Okay. The problem, again, you can see the foreign cards, and this is especially important in the Basque Country because in 2019, 17% of the expenditure on restaurants was with foreign cards. in this community compared to 13% for the overall Spain. Okay, so we have, some inclination to have more foreign customers in the restaurants of this region. And this is especially important in Guipúzcoa, where it's about almost 30%, and especially in July and August, it goes up to 35%. Okay, so it's a province that depends a lot on foreign tourism, and so it's important to think that the turnover of restaurants will not be fully recovered until we have the international tourist recovery. That's why I wanted to show you a little bit what are our forecasts for the tourist sector. Okay, so in the first chart, as I was saying, during the pandemic, things have changed so much and so quickly that we have to look for other sources of information that we generally were not using, like the internal car data that I just showed you, or Google Trends. So Google Trends allows you to see, what is the interest from foreign customers to visit Spain. So if you look at this data, you can see that there was a spike during the first state of alarm, probably most people that wanted to return home before, the frontiers were closed. Then we have, during the summer last year, some interest to return and travel to Spain, but it was clearly below what would be normal levels, which is these bands that you can see in gray here. And now, the latest data, it's still quite depressed, but you can see a clear recovery, okay, and that there is an interest to travel to Spain again. So this gives us some, degree of optimism, that as it's very sensitive to the restrictions that are in place. It's the same that we are seeing on restaurants. While there are restrictions, the expenditure is very depressed, but at the moment that you lift the restrictions, the expenditure is very sensitive. So it means that people is eager to go out. At some point, we have some fear of thinking, okay, maybe, after this pandemic, people will change the habits, they would not like to go to restaurants again, they would not like to travel again. Okay, the data doesn't seem to show that. What we see is that as restrictions are lifted, there is a huge, sensitivity in terms of activity or in terms of traveling, okay, or intention to travel, okay. That's why we have these predictions or this forecast for this year, especially in the second half of the year. We expect, some recovery on the tourism sector of about, 50% compared to last year. But of course, there is a huge base effect. Okay, if we compare to 2019, which was a record year for international tourism in Spain, we see that we will be still around 48% below that level. Okay, so we are talking about an important recovery, but still not a normalization of international tourism, of course, and not even next year we are expecting a normalization. It will take probably about 3 years before we return to pre-crisis levels. Okay, so a recovery that is here, it's taking hold, but it's going to take time. Another thing that we can look using our internal data is these consumption patterns, and we look at e-commerce. So we can distinguish between the points of sales that are physical and that requires the customer to be present to the moment of the transaction, or the ones that are done in the virtual points of sale. Okay, and what we can see in this chart, okay, here the data is a little bit more noisy. That's why we have this, a little bit more smooth line. But you can see in the red line, you have the e-commerce transaction information, and you can see some spike during the first lockdown, but you can see that this did not really maintain. And when we saw that data last summer, we were thinking, well, maybe e-commerce, we had this huge spike, but then this is normalizing. It's not, it's not a trend that we are seeing that it's maintained. And after seeing in October that this, increased again, and now even with the end of the state of the alarm, we see that this is still maintained very elevated. We think that what happened was more a supply problem. Okay, so there was a huge demand for e-commerce to buy food. Okay, to buy food in the supermarkets online, but probably the supply was not, ready to satisfy this huge increase in demand. It took some time, probably during the summer, but now what we are seeing is that in the second and the third wave, we've seen huge increases in e-commerce. It's still, the weight is not that high. This is what you have in the gray area. It increased from about 2.8% before the crisis, and now it's around 5%, okay? So it's not huge in terms of the market share. We are talking about 5% of the sales are online, but still an important increase, about doubling compared to the pre-crisis levels, okay? And finally, in terms of this data, I wanted to show you the indicators on the exports, okay, the agri-food exports. I think that one cannot look at the Spanish agri-food sector without understanding the importance of the external sector. Spain is the fourth largest exporter in terms of agri-food products in Europe, and the seventh in the overall world. Okay, so we are really a huge exporter of agri-food products. Of 53,000 millions in 2020. This is 20% of the exports of goods of Spain. Okay, so it's really a huge share of our balance of payments. Okay, and it contributes to the surplus with 1.7% of GDP. Okay, so we are really exporting a lot. Here you have the products that are the most important ones. Swine meat, okay, it's the first one, and it increased by 23% last year, okay? Most of it related to the African flu fever, okay? And we have these huge exports going to China, okay? They have to sacrifice a lot of the swine animals there, okay? So we have this huge increase, and we are seeing that for the data that we have for 2021, this is still going on, so we have huge increases still this year. The second product is citrus, probably also related to the pandemic. Okay, there was a huge demand from other European countries, oranges and this type of fruits. And then we have olive oil and wine that were more penalized by the crisis, okay? So we have declines, especially to the United States in terms of wine because of the tariffs that the Trump administration imposed for the Airbus and Boeing conflict. And I just read in the newspaper that this morning they have agreed to suspend this tariff for the next 5 years, okay? So with the new administration, the Biden administration, we are seeing a much, constructive way in these international relationships between the US and Europe, which probably is going to be very positive for this sector that is, very open to the external markets. And I always like to put this graph with a lot of history because you can see that this good performance of the sector was not due to the pandemic, okay? It's something more structural to the sector. There's been really an effort to internationalize by the companies of this sector, and you can see clearly these exports, the blue line, with this almost exponential trend through the years, okay? So this is showing the high competitiveness of the Spanish agri-food companies in the international markets, okay? And this is important because, the agri-food industry is really very dispersed and located in the overall territory of Spain. So it's not concentrated in one area. You can see that it's overall the territory. So it's important for the economic dynamism for all the regions in Spain. So going forward, it's important to maintain this competitiveness or gaining competitiveness in the international markets. And for this, we think it's going to be very important to have this push, to this change towards the digitalization, taking into account the sustainability of production and also taking into account social inclusion. As I said, it's very widespread in the territory, so it plays this role helping the rural development. And I think that we can think about these three elements, going together. So we have digitalization and industry 4.0, smart robotics, that will help also with the sustainability using water, energy in a more efficient way. Also, we have, the deployment of 5G in all the territory. Okay, so it's one of the programs of NGO that it's going to be pushing, and this will help social inclusion. See, if you have hyperconnectivity in all the regions, you can have people living everywhere in the territory. So I see these three elements really going together and having this push all together. I think that it's also important to understand digitalization as this general purpose technology. Okay, so this is the way we talk about it in economic terms. So it's similar to electricity. So when you have electricity in the 1800s, so for instance, there is data in the US that you have the first power plants in the 1880s, okay? But 20 years later, only 5% of the industry were using electricity, okay? And only if you go to the 1950s, so that is 70 years later, that you have most of the plants powered by electricity. So this is the type of technology that we are talking about, that it takes time to be diffused, because they are very disruptive. They keep all the old technologies, they make them obsolete, and you need infrastructure, so you need to create the 5G infrastructure, you need capital investment, you need human capital, so you need the capabilities, the workers need to be reskilled, so that they can use the new technologies, okay? So that's why, digitalization, it's important in this NGO program, that it's a push, that it's all the countries, all the European countries together at the same time, and all the sectors at the same time, because there is all these spillovers going on and helping, develop these technologies all at the time, okay? And I'm running out of time. I just wanted to show you some information that we gathered from Twitter. As I was saying, we have used all these other sources of information to understand how the digitalization is going on. So we gather information from Twitter, and we look at what are the technologies that are more popular in the primary sector and in the agri-food industry. And we see in the primary sector, big data, Internet of Things, probably related to the development of the agriculture of precision, okay? So you need all the sensors and all the data to take these real-time decisions. And in the agri-food industry, we find that is blockchain the one that is more popular. It does not mean that all industries or all the companies have blockchain in place. It means that it's the most popular. So probably because of the traceability, the transparency, with all this block technology, this is one of the technologies that it may make a huge difference. And just I wanted to conclude, 2021 will be the year of recovery thanks to the immunization, and I think this event is clearly an example, okay, so how things are returning in a way back to normal. Restaurants have been severely affected, and especially the ones that depend on international tourism, but we expect a recovery starting really very soon. Exports offer a path to grow for the agri-food sector, and Spain is really a huge exporter. And looking forward, looking at the medium term, we need to think with automation, digitalization, and sustainability as the elements that will move the sector. And with all that, I just wanted to invite you to take a look at our report in our website. Thank you.